My name is Rich Schmidt. We're here with Patrick McElligott. It's August 2nd, 2024. We're at Linfield University, McMinnville, Oregon. Patrick, thank you so much for joining us today. Tell your story. Just start it over if you wouldn't mind. Tell us your story.
So my family first arrived in the colonies, actually in Pennsylvania in 1736. That was a Quaker. The rest of the family's been pretty much Catholic. So I'm not sure what happened, but since they came from Kerry in Ireland, which is in southwestern Ireland, they might have been pirates or something. That's where a lot of people went to hide from the British. And the Vikings used to raid all around there. So it's very possible they really ticked somebody off, because in 1812 they went right into eastern Ohio, right into the teeth of the Indian Wars. And so they immigrated from there to Oregon on the Oregon Trail, but not in the first wagon trains, probably in the 1880s. In 1900, they purchased the ranch that we still own, and it's about 8,000 to 10,000 acres. It's a collection of old homesteads. So you'll have this, here's the Kincaid place, and over here's the Ball place, and there's Aunt Mary's grave, which is a grave with heaped up rocks right in the middle of one of the wheat fields. And she was the local midwife. And then there's the Adams place. Adams was the school where you had to walk 2 miles uphill and all on the way there and on the way back too. In the snow in summer.
Barefoot.
Yeah. I came from there. I really don't like farming. So out of that big ranch, only 3,600 acres of that were arable and able to be farmed. Eastern Oregon is the Columbia Plateau. It's all pretty much flat on top, except for the mountains and the foothills. Because the weight of different glaciers over periods of multiple ice ages, when they were so heavy that they just flattened the ground. And then when they melted off, they carved these really deep canyons, and you get down in the bottom of that canyon and there's a little creek you can step across with wild trout in it. So they make special combines to harvest grain for the Northwest and one other place in the world, and they have levelers on them. So these huge machines will be like this, completely on the level, whereas the header that cuts the grain has to be following the level of the hill. If the leveler goes out, you go down the hill and probably die. So I really hated farming because it's all machinery and it always breaks down. So, but in addition to that, if like 36% of the entire land mass was able to be farmed, then the rest of it, to utilize it, people run cattle or sheep, whichever. Morrow County was the scene of the last great sheep and cattle war in the United States. The ranchers shot 200 sheep and no sheep herders, which was interesting. So in the late 1800s, I think it was early 1900s. So all the Irish originally, when they came, ran sheep. It has the highest per capita amount of Irish in the whole state of Oregon. Mollahans, Monahans, Sweeneys, Swaggarts, Frenches, which is interesting, O'Donnells, et cetera, McElligotts. We lived in the middle of a whole bunch of people of Swedish descent, Petersons, Carlsons, Bergstroms. So I liked working with the animals, and I couldn't stand farming. So and I went to Ione High School. There were 12 people in my graduating class. We had 52 students and 8 teachers. So there were 4 of us in trig, 4 of us in chemistry, 4 of us in physics. The math teacher taught us Latin. It was really interesting because I received this incredible public school education, which has made me a big public school advocate. So that when I went to university, the very first term, I was in junior, senior, and grad courses. And I've always been an advocate for that. So I moved to Portland to go to University of Portland, went there 2 years, said, oh, this is really expensive. I'm going to Portland State. So I went to Portland State, and I love learning. It just fascinates me. I can't get over it. That's why I mainly turn on YouTube to music. There's all kinds of cultural stuff, and I just never get tired of it. So when I graduated, I actually went, I think, 7 years. I'm just like, oh no, I want to take that class. I want to take this class. So I got in a car wreck. I was in a VW Bug crush between two station wagons and broke 2 ribs and a face full of glass, and I couldn't do any physical labor. So after a month, I got some, I applied for welfare for a month, and then I went to work at a group home for Perry Center for Children in Portland, working with emotionally disturbed kids, and lasted there 2.5 years, longer than anyone ever was there. Left there, I had a girlfriend, and she had kids, and they were going to school in North Portland, and at a little school called Clarington, which was like a pod school. It was an all open space, and it was a fantastic school. And then they went to Portsmouth, and there was a lot of crime there and stuff. So one day I see this little kid chasing one of her children down the street, throwing rocks at him, and I'm like, hey, what are you doing? And just asked him, and he was shocked. Well, you're talking to me instead of screaming at me. So anyway, we started a private school in '76, and it went, and in '75 social work had run out of money, so I'd been out of work for 1.5 years, and they had a program. This was under Ford and Nixon, and IROL, and they had a program called Concentrated Employment Training Act. So what they would do is they would find you a job, often with an agency, public agency, and then the public agency would hire you. The feds would pay your salary in hopes that you would actually be hired by the agency. So I was also a musician, a rock and roll musician, playing in clubs at night. So I had 2 jobs that didn't support each other. So why not go for a third? So I went to CETA, and they said, we'd have an easier job getting you hired if you cut your hair. So I said, okay, went and got a haircut, walked in the next morning at 9 o'clock. Great. Now, if we send you somewhere and they want to hire you, you don't take the job, you turn it down, we dump you from the program. No problem. I want to work. Good. In an hour, you have an appointment at the Portland Police Bureau for a records clerk. So I go down there. The personnel officer, Carl Venable, this is 10 in the morning, is blowing vodka fumes in my face, and he interviews me and said, "You're just the person we wanted." And so I worked at the police department there for 2.5 years. It was very interesting. Auto records was quite. Sometimes it was a full-blown comedy. You answer the phone. Hello, I report a stolen car. Any idea who might have taken it? My wife, the blank, and she won't tell me where the keys are. The guy's just smashed. And I'm mentally cheering his wife on. So, but it was a much bigger party place than the wine industry will ever be. I guarantee you, because there's a lot of stressed people there. So I worked there till '78, and then we moved the school out to Pike, which is 5 miles out of Yamhill. Put it in an old farmhouse. This was during the '80s. High school was really cliquey. The more expensive way you showed up to the prom was, and the clothes that you wore and all of that were very important to people. And so we had a lot of really intelligent kids that had dropped out, and they would board during the week. And we actually got students into Oregon State. So did that for 16 years. Eventually it moved into town over here and in the building that now is owned by the Montessori School. So I started it, I taught, and when we were out in Yamhill, we started looking at how much we were making, because we were not making a lot of money, and it was like 17 cents an hour per person. So, so what I did, I saw an ad in the News Register for somebody working a tasting room. And I'd never done anything like that, but I thought, So I called up and I got Myron, 835-2362, the winery number. And I'm talking to him, and I mentioned Poire Williams Eau de Vie, which is the one where they grow the pears in the glass bottles in Alsace. And I knew I was hired immediately because from his reaction over the phone. So I started working for him on May 1st of 1980, ironically, back in agriculture. And although I still go to Eastern Oregon and chase cows around the mountains with my brothers. I worked for him for 28 years. So the first year, it was glorious. I was discovering all these things. He had a dry Riesling that was estate that was very much like Granny Smith apples. He had an Oregon Washington Riesling these were 79. That was from La Center, Salishan Vineyards up in La Center, Washington, and Amity Vineyards. And he, in 78, he had a Gewürz, and he talked about, it came from Eastern Washington, from Sagemore Farms, which is over by Pasco, huge vineyard. And he talked about camping out in the field, because with Gewürz, the acid drops really fast and the sugar's going up. So you've got two elevators passing each other at high speed. So you want to pick it just right. And it's interesting how you'll get Alsatian Gewürzes and they'll have acidity, same with the Pinot Gris and their Muscats, but here in the States, we don't get a lot of acidity in it, and the same with Chenin Blanc, which they grow in the mouth of the Loire. And I've had those that were sweet from Clos St. Catherine, Côte de Léo, clear back to 1927 in one of my tasting groups. They were still good. So I was just having a gas. And the pay wasn't fantastic, but he said, for every $1,000 worth of wine you sell in a day, you get a free bottle of your choice. And I chose very wisely. So he also was making Pinot Noir Nouveau, and he was getting those grapes from Sagemore. So what had happened is a lot of the early winemakers that moved here were from California. They were used to making Cabernet, Merlot, Sauvignon Blanc, grapes like that. And when they came up here, the only place to get those in Oregon was Southern Oregon, and the Southern Oregon wineries just had enough for themselves. Interestingly enough, the Washington wine industry wasn't really big. San Michel's first vintage was 72. So there was, Sagemore was where all these grapes were coming from. So Adelsheim made Semillon from Sagemore through 83, Merlot from Sagemore through 84. Then they quit making Semillon. They got, in 85 or 86, they got grapes from Lane Vineyard down by Medford, I think it was, but they were in the Rogue, and it wasn't as good, or it was a little more green. So Irie made Cabernet, Merlot, and Sauv Blanc up through 1980. Amity in 78 got Chardonnay grapes from Ciel de Cheval on Red Mountain. So there were a lot. It was glorious because you had the best of two different climates. You had a lot of Pinot, but you had a lot of bigger reds. You had a huge inventory of whites. Pinot became kind of the great Satan in that it was so profitable. You could make so much money on it farming compared to other grapes that it's really hard to find Gewürz anymore, because Gewürz yields unevenly, and the French call that couleur. So people don't like to grow it because one year you'll get this great crop and then the next year you'll get hardly anything. And Amity had, I think it was they had a clone they got from Ponzi that came from Mirasu in California. They had a little bit of Pomard. They had a lot of Vaudensville and a lot of Gamay Pinot, which is called a Droit clone in France, because when the canes come out, most Pinot, they go this way and that way, but with the Droit, they go straight up. And you'd get a lot of sassafras characters out of that grape. Not many people did much with it, but I really liked it. So his original, he was making Nouveau, carbonic maceration. The French call it maceration carbonique. And what they do is they would throw all the grapes in a big tank. The weight of the grapes would crush all the fruit in the bottom, and so they would inoculate that juice with yeast, and they would also cover the whole thing in the tank with carbon dioxide and then put a lid on it. As the carbon dioxide builds up, the fermentation is going on. When it's over, they draw off all the liquid and then they shovel the grapes out and press them, but you can bite into those grapes, and there's stems in there too. You can bite into those grapes and they fizz in your mouth a little bit. No, and at the time, I don't know, he just said, we don't know whether it's actually fermenting inside or it's CO2 being pushed in there. And nobody really, I've never heard an answer to that, ever. And it has a very distinctive character in the nose. From the process, a lot of people describe it as bananas. For a while, Willamette Valley Vineyards was doing that on a Pinot. And so I love to use that wine and just mess with the students, because I would get at Chemeketa, because I would show them that Pinot next to a Gamay Noir, which is the grape from Beaujolais, that was from Beaujolais that was not done that way. And they would always go, oh, this one's, they'd call the Pinot the Gamay Noir because they confused the process nose with the varietal nose. So then he stopped getting fruit, little by little he stopped getting fruit from the east side. In '77, he made 3 clonal wines, a Vaudensville from the estate, a Gamay from the estate, and he got Gamay from Sagemore. And he did a great job in '77. It was one of the rainy years. We had 40 years of bad sevens. 77, 97, and 2007, it just rained at harvest. Although by 2007, generally when you'd have rain and all the way people used to make the wine, you would get a cedary character in the flavor, and over time that would kind of dry the wine out and it would just kind of shrink. But in 2007, I didn't see that very much. '87 was so hot. I think that was the year that the harvest actually started in August, and when I began in 1980, it was middle of October, middle of November. 21 was the second earliest I can think of, because they started harvesting the first week of September. So I worked for Myron until the weekend before Christmas. He goes, well, we're closed this weekend, and all the way through January. And I said, oh, the money's been kind of great. And he goes, well, I have a tasting room about 7.5 miles away over at the Lawrence Art Gallery on Highway 18, and the woman who's running it, Joan, wants to quit. Why don't you go over there and check it out? So I go over there and check it out, and there were 22 wines from 12 wineries there. Some of the wineries don't exist anymore. There was a wild blackberry wine from Chalon in Astoria. There was the 78 Hillcrest Riesling, which was freaking stunning. $6 a bottle, 3% sugar, and it was incredible. And there was, we had wine from Century Home, which was a fruit winery in Newburgh. And at one point we had stuff from Big Fir, and they actually did a sparkling raspberry and a sparkling blackberry, as well as still wines. I remember the Sokolblosser 78 Pinot, the Henry Estate 78 Pinot. Those wines were incredible, just fantastic. So after about 4 months of me doing this, Myron comes in one day and he goes, "Can we talk?" I thought, uh-oh. He says, "You've doubled my sales in 4 months. I'm going to make you a manager." And I said, "Oh, good. What's the pay scale?" And he goes, "Oh, there's no raise. You just have to do analysis by hand on all this stuff." So then here I was having to do these whole spreadsheets by hand and pencil for months upon time, but kept going. It was at that point the Oregon Wine Grape Growers Association, or the marketing board, was actually, they would just ask the wineries to count the number of people that walked through the door. And I went, well, this is ridiculous, because that doesn't tell you anything. They walked through the door, it doesn't mean they bought anything. So we started analyzing. We would count the number of people in a group, we would find out where they were from. It was divided up by the three most affluent sections of Portland, the rest of Oregon, Western Washington, and the rest of the United States. And so what we found was that 40% of the people walking through the door were actually pretty much gallery goers that wanted to drink free wine. So they were 7% of the money. And the rest of Oregon, about a third, was about 33% were 30% of the money. And 26% of the people coming in were from Western Washington, from Longview, Kelso, all the way to Bellingham. They were 56% of the money. And even though I advocated it for years, I never saw any evidence of anybody really promoting Oregon in Seattle. And people would come down. The Thanksgiving tasting weekend was huge with Western Washington people, and eventually Portland traffic killed it completely. Well, Portland and Dundee, and then the fact that if you were driving from north of Seattle, you went through Seattle, Tacoma, Olympia. It's like, okay, I'm free. Oh, here's Portland. Oh, here's Dundee. So it really, really changed the whole way things were going. And then we had problems. What we were doing was buying at FOB, which would be half of retail. And then I had to go pick up the wine myself. So that's an FOB thing. When distributors from out of state or in state pick up the wine, they end up paying for the transportation, and we were doing it like that. But also I made a commitment to open those wines, because otherwise it would have been an unfair advantage. And the distributors hated us. Some of them were just rabid. And I remember calling up Greg Lemma and saying, hey, if you give me a list of your accounts, the Portland crowd doesn't really buy that much here, so we can steer people that'll make it much better for you. And they wouldn't do it. Another guy named Ralph that had a distributorship called International Wines, I tried to talk to him one day, and his mind just, I watched his head explode. And he was never coherent. I couldn't figure out. And finally one guy said, well, sometimes if you're selling one kind of wine, so let's use Jordan as an example from California. You want to carry their Cabernet, but in order to get it, you have to sell so much of their Chardonnay. And he said, so when somebody's cutting into the amount of wine available in those cases, that's why some people get upset. And then we became Retailer of the Year. I think it was 86 or 96, and then that was another great big hubbub. You should be able to find that, I think. And people just had a fit about it. And then they were trying to do all this stuff about shipping, and people played around with trying to buy off the distributors, because they also were opposing shipping between states. And that would not just distributors here, but elsewhere. It's like, oh, that's going to cut into what I'm doing. And it actually shouldn't, because even when they pay for the shipping and buy the wine and sell it wherever they're selling it, it's still going to cost you more if you get it from the winery and have it shipped because of UPS charges and all that. So, and now everybody gets sales tax added on, thanks to the Supreme Court. So that when the shipping started between states, suddenly it was very interesting because the states that really got upset were the 13 original colonies. And they were flipping out about it. And it's like, didn't you have a harbor full of tea, you know, because of a tax stamp? And here you are, which goes around seems to come around. Took 200 and some years, but they made it back to where they started. So anyway, we went through all this political crap all the time. And the gallery continued to grow. Myron had approached Dave Lett about carrying his wine. There was a kind of an odd competition between them. Myron would say, Papa Pinot. And David would try one of Myron's wines and goes, nice wine, too astringent though. You know? And one day I looked out, there was a parking lot right across the street, looked out our window. The room was very, very small. It was in the Lawrence Gallery, and people would generally walk through there to get in the gallery. And I see this woman get out of a car, and she's got 2 bottles of wine. I thought, oh, that's kind of odd. And then she went into the front of the gallery, and I didn't think anything of it. And then she walked in, and it was the 78 Adelsheim Semillon and 78 Adelsheim Chardonnay. And so I picked up Adelsheim. And I love those wines. So Myron was kind of amazed. You're getting people that I asked that didn't do it. Ponzi at that time had a completely dry Riesling too. The dry Rieslings now, most of them are kind of overdone. They're too big. You know, they don't have the structure and a little more alcoholic than they were then. But back then, the wines, people were picking at lower sugars, so the acids were higher. So one of the things I would do is I started going to the Newport Seafood and Wine Festival in '81, and I would go out and taste other people's wines and ask them if they wanted to sell to us, to the tasting room. But after 3 days of tasting wines, there was so much acid, my tongue and gums would be bleeding. And for anybody that's curious about it, when they go tasting, people think, oh, I need water because I'm going to dehydrate because of the alcohol. But there's so much acid in wine, and acid sucks moisture out of you. You should also never brush your teeth within 30 minutes of drinking wine because the enamel is really softened from the acids in the wine. So something you don't find out about till the stuff has just really reamed your teeth. And growing up in Eastern Oregon, we had natural fluoride in the water, so I never had a cavity till I moved to this side of the mountains where the water's soft and went into the wine industry. It's like, yow. So anyhow, I did that for 28 years. Eventually, we moved out of the Lawrence Gallery, and they were going behind our back with another winery. I won't bother to mention the people. The same people, and so we moved it up to Amity for a while. Then he got the store right next to the Lawrence Gallery, moved back into that. But and so we went from 1980 through June of '08. I went to the Newport Seafood and Wine Festival from '81 through '07, probably longer than anybody had ever attended it, I think, any one person. And I probably have sold more wine person to person than anybody in the history of Oregon wine. I've actually worked marketing and in-state and out-of-state, and also mostly retail though. And I've done marketing in and out of state, both for Amity and Shanann. And I always get excited when I taste a wine. If I didn't carry it in my tasting room and I approached somebody and they said, no, I don't want to do that. I don't think that, some of the people is like, I don't think that's right. And I would say, well, if you don't want to do it, I'm happy to tell you where I think you'd have good luck selling your wine. And some of the people would just be so polarized by the whole idea that they didn't go for that. But I do a lot of that too with my students. And after all those free bottles I got, I have so much wine at home. My home is overrun by it. There's an incredible amount of cases. And I'm not a huge drinker. It's more the taste and the smell and the history aspect of it. So, for instance, 2 years ago at Christmas, Jeff, you interviewed the other day, had the restaurant above the gallery for a while, and we're good friends. So I took a 79 Elk Cove Reserve Pinot, a 79 Schaefer Vineyard Cellars, not California, Oregon, Gales Creek, and an 83 Hidden Springs over to his house, and they were all fantastic, in great shape. So it's really interesting to go back and try those things. And then I have a friend who named Bob Necker, and he had this idea about doing a wine map. So what he did is he went to all the wineries that he wanted to put on the map, and went and tasted at each one of those wineries and bought a case of wine. When he got the map put together, to promote it, he invited all the winemakers who were on the map and served them all each other's wines. And I remember Bill Fuller flipping out, "You're just trying to make money off of us." And I thought, he spent money for you, you know? It was really peculiar. But Bob still has a lot of those old bottles. So he gave me 79 Bingen Mount Elise the other day, and that would have been right across it was a Pinot, right across the river from Hood River. At one point, the family of Melissa, who was the winemaker at Stoller and now is the GM, I believe, she and her husband, Simon, were taking classes at Chemeketa, and the family was actually going to purchase that property and decided not to do it. And that's when she got started. So it was pretty interesting. You see all these segues that just revolve around it all. The Pinot Noir celebration. I was dating this woman that was a record rep, and we were having dinner at Nick's, and I think it was John that passed, that used to work with Nick, and he was saying something about, "Oh yeah, we're going to do this whole thing," and my girlfriend's like, "Well, you should get Patrick involved," and I'm like, just don't, they've got it all locked up. They know what they're doing. So at one point, they used to screen the wines to go with the IPNC, and it was very interesting because Myron he was scheduled to taste, he couldn't do it, so he asked me to do it. So I was tasting with Terry Castile, John Paul, Kathy Josephs from Fiddlehead Cellars, California, Jim Clendenin from Aubonne Clement, and Ken Patton, who had been in charge of HP and a big supporter, and then he started a company selling some of the Oregon wines and then sold it to the Schultzes. And so we were up tasting in, I don't remember what the building was. It might have been here on campus, and screening. And I remember I really liked the Sinsky wine, but they dumped it on, I think they dumped it on political stuff because he'd offended somebody. And then there was one of the top wineries whose wine didn't make it, and I saw that it was in there, and I said, "Hey, that didn't make it." "Oh, it's there because everybody wants to try it. Don't say anything to anybody." And I was like, uh-huh. And it was interesting because we got to the second day, and when we were tasting Oregon, after tasting California, and one of the people, I think it was John Paul, said, "Geez, these wines are dark." And I said, "What? You don't know? We were tasting under fluorescent lighting. Fluorescent lighting makes," they said brown, turns red to brown. it had the wavelengths of light coming out of fluorescent lighting alter color. And this person had been, whoever it was, whether it was John Paul or not, they'd been grading wines down because they looked brown, which would be a sign of oxidation, but they were fine. And I had to explain to all these people that had been in the business about as long as I had, oh, these lights are actually causing that problem. It sort of shocked me. You know, I never thought that they would know that, but they probably didn't use fluorescent lighting at their wineries. Going back a little bit in terms of years, so I've had the wines, I've had Irie back to 72, Eref back to 75, Amity back to 76, Elk Cove back to 77, Sokolblosser back to 77. Wasn't a good year for them. As a lot of people just made rosé, I think, in 77 and 84. 84 is the wettest harvest I ever remember. All it did was rain. Myron held off on picking the Riesling to the end, and it was green slime. It was really bad. And it was funny because I took a 84 Burgundy out of my cellar and brought it to that same class that I shared the 74 Curry with, and it was corked. But when you open a corked bottle, often there's a tiny few moments, well, it's not too bad. As it gets more oxygen, the compound just gets worse and worse and worse and more bitter and takes all the fruit out of the wine. So right at the beginning, it was really interesting. It was also a low fill, so it was oxidized a little bit too, but there was tremendous acidity. And I thought, I bet they had the same weather we did, and I looked it up and they did. So often there are parallels between Oregon and Burgundy and weather. The difference is their falls are drier for much longer, and the same with Germany, because they're a lot further from the ocean than we are. That's why we don't see many late harvests or ice wines, because the storms come in off the Pacific and you'll get rot before that'll happen. But going back again, the first ice wine in Oregon was a Riesling from 1978 from Hillcrest. And when I have a partial bottle of it that's probably had a leaky cork, so it's not worth drinking, but when I find that, I'm donating it.
Awesome.
So he had kind of a modern art label that was a little funky, mainly just sort of blue and white. And but that wine was, it was 13% sugar. It was really incredible. And Elk Cove had one, I don't know if it was an ice wine, but it was pretty amazing, and it was an 81 Riesling in half bottles. Bethel Heights in 85 picked Gewürz when it was frozen, but they didn't get it into the press in time, and they couldn't call it ice wine. And about 7 or 8 years ago, I still had a half bottle of it, and one of my students, Debbie, now makes wine down in the Umpqua, and she used to live in this little house off Edgewater behind the Safeway in Salem, and she would have these huge feasts. And so she had this great big dinner and invited Pat Dudley over. And when I found Pat was going to be there, I'm like, okay. So I brought the wine. We opened it. There were like 6 or 7 people. We all got a little taste. And then I was able to send the rest of it home. And none of the Castiles had any of that left. So they were able, everybody in the family was able to try it. And I love doing that because I've saved some of these wines and the people haven't tasted their own wine for decades, and then I'll give it to them because I have this weird taste memory thing. So when I taste a wine, and some of them I'd like to forget, but I can't. So the other thing that's interesting about growing up on a cattle ranch is Myron recognized it pretty quickly that I could smell flaws really easily. When you grow up in a dry climate, you really are sensitive to odors. And I wasn't born in a barn, but I grew up next to one. So a lot of flaws in wine mimic animal byproducts. So hydrogen sulfide smells like rotten eggs. And at one point, malolactic fermentation has an eggy smell to it. Then Brettanomyces, which is a yeast that gives you really good flavors in Belgian ale, in wine has some unfortunate odors. It will eat the sugars that the primary fermentation yeast, Saccharomyces, won't eat. So when Robert Parker started advocating Francois Frere barrels, one of the things that was making them so popular for him was the way that they were toasting the barrels. They were, when you do a barrel, you want the wood to be green because you heat the wood and the sap turns to steam and then you can bend it. So they found out how to caramelize the oak sugars on the inside of the barrel so the first two vintages are sweeter. But Saccharomyces won't eat that yeast, but Brettanomyces will. And the nicer smells in Brettanomyces are gingerbread, iodine, which I would say South Africa and Oberon, tobacco pouch, which is not uncommon, and leather. And some of those can be pleasant in very small amounts. Then you get into, I have a lot of women mention Band-Aid to me, and I belong to this incredible tasting group where we've had Mouton back to 1880 and Yquem back to 59. And Cheval Blanc 1976 was like walking into a huge room that was nothing but made of Band-Aids. It just smelled like a gigantic Band-Aid. So, but I don't get that as often as some other people. But I do smell cow manure, horse sweat, and horse urine. And the horse urine was in a Chardonnay that, because I do wine judging, and we had it one day, and it came in late, and the people doing that said, well, you don't have to taste this, you know, it's the end of the day, and this came in late. And we said, did they pay? Yeah, okay, we'll do it. So about 4 minutes later, we're all going, what is that smell? And I realized it's horse pee, you know, which is pretty rank and yeasty smelling. So you get those odors, and I'm uniquely qualified from growing up on a cattle ranch to recognize them. So, so I've always been doing that quality control stuff, and people would ask me to come up there. At one point, Greg at White Rose had me come up and check some of his barrels, and he had a little Brett in the Temperance Hill, and then Bill Barron was having me check his, and he had one barrel. It was really odd. It smelled like rotten fish, and then suddenly we couldn't find the odor. And after he bottled it, his first vintage he bottled was 97. So there's another compound called dimethyl sulfide, and it kind of smells like you dropped yeast on a hot burner. But people confuse it with H2S, hydrogen sulfide, all the time. With hydrogen sulfide, you treat it with copper and a little air, and the odor goes away. If you're wondering if that's what you have, you can take 2 glasses, pour the wine into both, a couple ounces, take one, and there's not much copper in pennies, so you have to get a whole lot of pennies. But throw 4 or 5 in one, swirl them both, let them sit for a couple minutes, and smell them. And if it's hydrogen sulfide, the one with the pennies will smell a little bit metallic, but it won't stink anymore. So people would treat dimethyl sulfide with sulfur, and they wouldn't smell it anymore. And they think it was all done. And Bill bottled his first vintage, and about 3 months later, would have been best of those wines I ever tasted, and because it was 04, which was, or excuse me, 07, which all it did was rain. And he opened it up about 3 months later, and it was like, whoa, what a stink. So he had to dump it all out, treat it, and somehow, and then rebottle it, and it just beat the crap out of it, and it was never quite the wine. It was like Harvey made Schaefer in '81 made this Riesling that was incredible, And I tasted it out of the tank, and it had papaya and tropical fruits. It was amazing, and he bottled it, and it was never like that again. It went through bottle shock and just completely changed. So there's a lot of things that go on. So anyway, I worked for Myron for 28 years. I could see, and a lot of it had to do with 07 and 08. Nobody was traveling, and that's where most of our business came from. So I could see he was going to close it down. So I actually talked to Peter. So for about a year and a couple of months, I worked 2 full-time jobs. And so in April of 07, I went to work for Peter. And
Peter Rosbeck.
Yeah, of Sineann, Sineann. And then in June of 08, I stopped working for Amity because Myron shut the tasting room down. And so, because the business had just bottomed out. At that point, after starting with 22 wines from 12 wineries, I had over 300 wines from over 100 wineries. So I had a lot of bonus bottles to choose from. It also gave me a really good look at how different people's wines aged, too. And a lot of these guys' wines have held up just fantastically over the years.
What do you attribute that to?
Structure, you know, you need a certain amount of acid. It's just like with Peter, his wines, what's unusual is his wines taste like they're ready to go right away, but they age and age and age. And in the last few years, he hasn't actually physically done the labor of making the wine for a number of years before he had Parkinson's. He had a fellow named Russ working for him that had worked at Rock Block and Argyle, and Russ was a great guy. And in 18, he started having trouble with his eye, and it went from 20/20 to 20/70. And it hurt, and it was watering, and we'd sit in the office and taste wine, and he would rub his eye, and then a little later he'd pick up a glass and hand it to me. Well, a couple weeks after that, I got shingles, even though I had a shingles shot. So I think he had shingles in his eye. But eventually he talked to Peter in late 18 after harvest, and they decided that Russ would retire. Peter kept him on payroll and insurance for an extra 3 months, which was great. And then Russ had 2 lots in Yamhill. He sold one of them to a developer. I helped him clear it off. One day in 19, he called me up and said, "Hey, come on over. Let's hang out." So I go over there, and usually he had something he wanted to do, but I'm like, oh, this is really cool. So we sit down, and he pours us each a glass of really good champagne and says, well, I'm dying. And he had liver, lung, and esophageal cancer. And he said, I know what to expect. It happened to my folks. So he, within 10 days, he was gone. But we were able to sit and talk for 5.5 hours. So that was his gift to me. And so then Peter's daughter, Sydney, under Peter's directions, made the 19s. And then after that, we've been leasing. We originally were at Medici for years. In 13, Hal Medici was becoming more and more difficult to deal with. He was making mistakes. Peter would make his wine, but in 11 was the latest harvest in decades, all the way up and down the West Coast. They were harvesting in Sonoma in October. So I said, Hal, you need to drop some fruit so the grapes get ripe. And he's like, that's never going to happen anyway. I'm not going to worry about it. So comes time to harvest, and they're only 18 bricks, which you want them at least up around 21. And he decided to harvest them. So when that happens, when the pH is, I think of it as acid strength. The acid's way up, the pH is way down, which means it's really strong, and you don't get a lot of color. So you didn't get a lot of color, and the grapes didn't smell the wine didn't smell very good, and Russ worked on that thing for a long time to get it right. So that wine wasn't very good. It was more like a rosé. And then in 13, it was really humid. And he didn't drop any leaves. He got rid of his vineyard management company and didn't pull any leaves, and they got mold between the skin of the grape and the flesh of the grape. That thing stunk. Russ agonized over it. He wrestled with it for about a year, and finally they bottled it. So, and in 2012, Hal didn't hire any pickers. And that was the year that all these guys came up from California to work and went, oh, you're not paying me enough, and I don't work in the rain. So, and of course there was rain, like always. So there were all kinds of issues there. So finally in 2013, plus the winery had acetobacter in it, which would cause volatile acidity in the wine, and it had Brett in the cellar too. So Peter had started Shenane with David O'Reilly. They had met and made the decision sometime in the early 90s. They were both working crush at Elk Cove. And David's father had moved them, I think, from Londonderry in Northern Ireland. They were Catholic, so that put them on low on that totem pole. So they went to the Maritime provinces in Canada, then moved to BC. And David was devout Catholic, and he was going to be a priest. Then he met this woman who's now his wife and the mother of 7 girls, I think it is. So
a lot of daughters.
Yeah. So I have 7 sisters and 3 brothers. My sisters know more than any man alive, and I know that because they tell me. Peter became the winemaker at Medici in 97 after Eric Hamaker had left after 96. And David and Hal didn't get along very well, and David was the sales guy and Peter was the winemaker. Well, Peter taught David how to make, Peter says, I taught David how to make wine, he taught me how to sell wine. So after a while, David just went, I got to move out of here. And he moved up to Yakima, and it went really well, and then they had a fire, and he had to move back down. So when he did, he moved down to what's now Lady Hill, which is a century farm owned by the Owens, and Jerry and Elaine, and it's across the road from Champoy Park, so there's a lot of history there. And Ben Wolf actually and his wife were the attorneys that he sold some of the winery to, in my understanding, and Ben had actually represented the Oregon Wine Board. And at one point, I had met Ben because we were having a lot of problems at the Newport Seafood Food and Wine Festival. You'd go there, the OLCC would show up and start making up rules that didn't exist. And there's a whole structure of things they have to go through to make certain rules and laws. But the guys would just show up on the weekends and go, oh, well, I don't have a supervisor here, and they're not going to be able to get a hold of one, so I'm going to just tell them whatever. So the very first time I went there, the local OLCC rep was this guy named Ernie. And he was very supportive. He said he knew that people had to taste wine to make sure it wasn't corked. So he said, well, in order to do that and not have people think that you're drinking, just step out from behind the booth and very conspicuously spit it out in a cup. And okay. And then I remember the beer distributor down there went and dropped a long case of Budweiser at every winery booth that year in '81. And so a few years after that, I was in Astoria. And the Astoria Festival had started down in the docks in an old processing plant. And then they moved it to Camp Rylea, which didn't work too well because it was in a bunch of equipment bays, a National Guard equipment bays, and you'd have to walk out in the weather, which was cold and wet and rainy. And then they had it in a giant tent in Warrenton, and it was really cold. So Richard Mansfield was sitting behind me. Richard had been the winemaker at Garden Valley and then Callahan Ridge. And he had, in '87, he had made a late harvest Riesling that was botrytis with 36% residual sugar. And he called it Vinum Aurolium, the golden wine. And so I wanted to taste it. So I did exactly what I was supposed to do, and I spit it out, and a hand falls on my shoulder, and a voice says, "If I see you do that again, I'm going to shut you down." And I look around, and here's all these guys sitting in their booths with a glass of wine in their lap. They're drinking to stay warm. I'm not going to say a word about it, you know. And I turn around, and it's a local OLCC agent. He actually had a remarkable resemblance to Larry of the Three Stooges. I mean, it was phenomenal. And I said, "But this is what I was told to do by an OLCC agent." He goes, "I don't care. If I see you do it again, I'm going to shut you down." I went, whoa. A couple months later, I went to the OLCC in Portland to get a one-day pouring permit to do an event in Portland. And I said something to the secretary, and she said, "Oh, he's in the building trying to get everybody to do it his way now." And then, so what people used to do is you could just have volunteers go and pour. Then now we all have to take this test every 5 years and get a pouring permit and pay the people who do the class about $25, pay the OLCC about $25. And one of their lines is, "Well, this was asked for by the hospitality industry." Yes, it was asked for by the big boys who wanted their insurance premiums to go down. And that's how that happened. So we had all kinds of stuff, but they had a guy in the OLCC down in Newport eventually. So then people used to just, "Okay, well then we'll just fill out a form and we won't take the class." So they'd fill out the forms and just work that event and not take the class. So then they started cracking down on that. So they had to have a pouring permit. And you're not supposed to drink while you're working, but you can taste and spit. But the OLCC hated that. And so it became this whole issue. So finally I went to Ben Wolf and said, "You know, this is baloney. People that have corks in their bottles need to be able to tell, because when you first open it up and it's corked, it doesn't really show except on the palate." And he came back and said, "Well, the OLCC said if you do that, then they're just going to bust people right and left and tell the legislature that you're all drunks." So we had to back off on that. Now I think you can do like 4 wines. Things changed a lot when marijuana became legal. They had a lot of things to do, and they're really actually very helpful now. There's a woman in Astoria named Carla Clayton, and unfortunately she retired on the 31st. She has been so professional, a total joy to work with. And there's been a number of other agents that I've just really enjoyed working with. And it was pretty funny because a friend and I, during the second Iraq War, I'd been an anti-war activist during Vietnam. And on a Bring the GIs Home committee with William Stafford, the poet, John Callahan, the cartoonist, Steve McCarthy from Clear Creek Distillery, and a bunch of people like that. And so I was just like, this is ridiculous. This whole thing was a setup. You know, the whole yellow cake thing, that was all manufactured, and they found it out later that it was false. So I thought, oh, this would be funny to have somebody should do a label that says Pinot No War. And I told this friend of mine who worked for Cordy Brothers in Sacramento and was a chiropractor, he goes, "That's a great idea, let's do it." I thought, oh, dang. So we sent it in. I thought, oh, they'll never approve that. It came back immediately. Somebody went, "I'm getting this approved before it's too late." And there's other interesting things. Jacques Tardy, who's been at Tory Moore for a while and used to be at Montenor, he had a label called Bonne Merde. And merde is French for manure. So in other words, good S-H-I-T. And so they had approved it, and 3 years later they pulled it, which they're not allowed to do. So I was just like, well, it'll never fly, but it came right back. So we started doing it, and the first bottling wasn't very good through people not giving us the wine that we'd tasted and giving us flawed wine. And we did it up at White Rose, and Greg's winemaker, who he called Shujin, was just this wonderful man, Hispanic, and he died a couple years ago.
Jesus.
Yeah, it was really sad. Jesus Guillen. And I made him a whole bunch of CDs. He goes, "Oh, these are my people's music," you know. And so he goes, "You know, that Syrah they gave you to blend in with the extra Pinot, with the Pinot, was the VA was illegal. And then they gave us oxidized Viognier to put in the rest of the Syrah. And it wasn't White Rose that did it. I won't say who it was. But so that batch wasn't good. But we did it one more time. And we were talking to DuPont. And there was a fellow named Bert Fernandez who had a vineyard called Saga Vineyard. And Bert is really Swedish. I mean, it's like talking to the Swedish chef on the Muppets. And but very nice man. So we bought 110 cases, a little bit of Brett, but not bad at all, and of his Pinot, of the Pinot they made for him, and put our own label on it. And it said Pinot Noir, Gondis Cuvée. There was a dove in the background with grape clusters in its mouth, and doves all around the borders with grape clusters. And there were only 3 places in Portland that would carry it because the label was too controversial. Sold like crazy in Eugene.
How did you become connected with Chemeketa?
It was interesting. Out of the blue, they were going to start the program, and they talked to a guy named Bob Sogi, who had worked for Henny Hinsdale, which became Columbia. And for years, he'd been in the business. He took a lot of photographs. And he was teaching wine classes on the side, and somebody, it might have been Myron's wife, Vicky, or Myron, suggested possibly me. And I came in, and they pretty much just hired me on the spot like they did with Bob. I'd never written a syllabus, so I looked at Bob's syllabus and used the format, but not anything that he was doing. And at first he was like, you stole it off of mine. And then I said, no, look, it's all different. And he was fine. So the first winemaker was Lowell Ford from Illahee, who actually, we make Gruner, but his Gruner is the closest thing to an Austrian Gruner that I've had out of all the Oregon wineries, and there's lots of other really great ones. That one just happens to be very, very close to an Austrian one. So then there were a lot of know-it-alls that first went through the program, and they kind of made his life hell. So then we had Jessica, who had actually worked at Amity in the cellar, and when I was working at Oregon Wine Tasting, I was always through Amity, and so I knew a lot of the cellar people. And so she was going to OSU, and she became the winemaking instructor for a while. Then she was replaced by Barney Watson. And Barney Watson had been the head of the program at OSU, Oregon State. And I'd first encountered, OSU used to do this wonderful thing they called Grape Day, and I think they still do it. But the first time I went, I learned so much. They had this thing where they showed us, the vineyard, Woodhall Lane that they were getting Pinot from, it was always really green and grassy. So they had some Woodhall Lane Pinot with no malolactic. And then they had malolactic from Irie, malolactic bacteria from Erath, a wild malolactic, and a malolactic from Florida. And the very first thing you notice is that the wine tastes kind of thin without the ML, but then with the ML, it's almost like it's been in a neutral barrel, no oak flavors, but now it's rounded out and fuller. And the pH has actually risen a point or two, and the acid is changed from malic, which is the primary fruit acid, to lactic acid, which helps you digest your food. So I remember the flavor of the wild one was raspberry, and the Florida one was utterly bizarre. And of Irie and Erath, one was more cherry and the other was smoky cherry. So we saw, that just things like that. Then they pointed out how if you have botrytis in red grapes and you want to make red wine, how to use charcoal to take the influence of the mold out and stuff like that. And so they also did something with the aroma wheel because one of the professors that came up with that was from OSU, and I think maybe both, but then went to Davis and taught. And I don't really use the aroma wheel because it's interesting. And I tell everybody this at the beginning of class. It's experiential. What you smell is experiential. And that's most of your sense of taste. So, because your memory and your sense of smell are close to each other in your brain. And that's because when we were primitive beings, when we smelled something a little rotten in terms of meat, it was a source of food and also somebody who might eat you. So, or maybe a poisonous plant had a certain odor and you knew to avoid it, and things like that. So I tell everybody for class, there's no wrong answers. And yet, we'll get to the first wine, I'll pour the first flight. There'll be 4 different wines in sensory evaluation wine varietals. Nose on number 1. Students freeze up immediately. And it takes a lot to get people to talk, and some people really have problems talking in class. And I also tell the students, we're going to get about 30 wines a night. And that seems like a lot. You'll be tasting and spitting. You'll be fine. You drink lots of water. But, if you want to be a part of the wine industry, that's nothing, because you can have 150 to 200 wines in a day as a wine judge. And so you just have to suck it up. They do an evaluation at the end of the class, and there's always somebody complaining, "They gave us too much wine, oh God." So, even though you tell people, they just don't process it. But what I'm doing it for, so many wines a night, is they're not getting high, but I want them to react without thinking. Because when you start second guessing, you come up with wrong answers. So it's just what I'm doing with sensory evaluation wine varietals right now is the class I'm teaching is I'm showing them different examples of wine. So let's say the first tasting day is Chardonnay, Pinot Gris, and Pinot Blanc. And the reason for that is Pinot Noir has an uneven number of chromosomes. It's one of the 2 parents of Chardonnay. The other one being Gouais, which Bjornson made a couple years ago, and probably this last year too. And it's a grape that they don't do very much with in France anymore because it's so prolific and doesn't have a clearly distinctive flavor. And it mutates. So Pinot Gris is the most common mutation of Pinot Noir, and Pinot Blanc's the least. So we do those 3. So we'll pour 4 Chardonnays. One of them's cool climate, perhaps. One of them is maybe stainless steel. One of them's stainless steel with Lees contact, dead yeast cells, things like that. Another one has a whole lot of barrel to it. And I'm showing them different ways that these are made, and I'm hitting them with them over and over again. So we all taste through them, then we discuss, we go through the nose, the palate, the finish, and things like that. And then it's revealed to them, and a lot of them are just fascinated by how much alcohol's in there. They're like, "What's the alcohol? What's the alcohol?" It's kind of odd. But I actually wrote 3 of the courses. I wrote 4, but they lost the tasting room management course. It took them 7 to 11 years to decide to do it, and by that time they'd already lost the course content outline. But I wrote Wines of the Pacific Northwest, Sensory Evaluation of Wine Varietals, and Sensory Evaluation of Wine Components, which is really technical. And I used a student white or red for the control, and then you would have 3 ascending levels of acid in the first flight. In the second flight, 3 ascending levels of tannin. Third flight, 3 ascending levels of alcohol, 3 ascending levels of sugar. Then we would go to sulfur dioxide, which is added to wine to preserve it. I tried sorbates once. It was really unpleasant, and so we never did it again. And then I would add vinegar because that is a winemaking flaw. A little bit of vinegar will sweeten the nose and sweeten the palate. And as the level of vinegar goes up, the astringency starts back here, and as it increases, the astringency moves forward in your mouth, and it just dries your mouth out. And so it was really odd because people didn't respond to vinegar as much. I was doing 3 additions on the others. I went clear out to 5. And remember in one class, and my eyes were burning, and people weren't even noticing it. I was shocked. And then there's another compound called EA, ethyl acetate, which is also from oxidation, and it smells like acetone. But I asked Barney as the winemaking instructor, so what can I use for that? And he goes, oh, get nail polish remover. I went all over Salem, and all the nail polish remover is scented. So I finally went to Fred Meyer and bought a can of acetone. Nobody could taste it, but you could at least smell it and knew what it was like. So, and this year will be the 25th year of the program and my 25th year of teaching. This last year, employment was so high that not many people were taking the classes, and for the first time in 25 years, I only had 2 students. And I taught for years at reduced income to make the program go, because it was really great. They actually, after a couple of years, people in McMinnville are like, well, we're the heart of the Oregon wine country, you need to do it here. And they did about 1 year where they had much going, and after 2 years, wine appreciation was the only class left going. And eventually, I had 8 people, and I was doing it out at Jeff's restaurant in the gallery, and they were driving from Portland, of all places, which takes longer to get here than it was to Salem, and Bob had 8 people down in Salem, so I said, let's just combine the class, and I'll give up teaching at this time because I want the program to go. And so that's what we did. And then he had 16 students. They wanted at least 12 in the beginning. So, and we've had much bigger classes too. So,
who have the students mostly been? Have they been people in the industry? Have they been interested consumers?
There's interested consumers, and a lot of people that want to get into the industry. And then there's another thing that's happened over the years, and that is when the guidance office doesn't know what to do for a person to have a job, they will put them in the wine program. So I met a very good friend. His wife used to be the head of nursing at George Fox. Then she was the dean of nursing at OSHU in La Grande. And now she's the dean of nursing at the University of Alaska. And they live in Anchorage. But he had worked for FedEx, injured his back badly, and had some thing with all these calcium deposits they call arachnosis, like a spider. And he tried when he made the claim, they tried to get compensation from FedEx, and they found a way not to have to pay. So but they said, we'll pay for him to be re-educated. So he was taking the classes, and I was frustrated about something political one day, and I said something, and Stephen said, well, blah, 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 and I thought, this guy's really interesting. We aren't on the same level politically, but he's really interesting, and we got to be really good friends. And actually, he worked for Hal Medici selling his wines for a while, and also, can't remember the name right now, but they're out on 22. He's German.
Oh yeah, the Wetzels.
The Wetzels, yeah, and
Chateau Bianca.
Yeah, and he's a little So Stephen worked for him for a little while. I knew his dad too. His dad was wonderful and was involved with Laurel Ridge for a while. So he did that, but when he started moving around, you know, it's like not much going on in Anchorage, although we do have a distributor there now. So I've met a lot of really interesting people over the years, and now there's this whole thing about, oh, we're going to take the SOM exam. And so I've been fortunate because I was subbing for the tasting group I was talking about, which is like wines people never get to try. Very few people in the world. And so Myron and two of the Castiles were in it, and they got all irritated because these guys were Francophiles and they weren't tasting any Oregon wines, so they dropped out. And which means I didn't have to pay as much money to get in, and I got in. So it's about $600 a year for 6 tastings, and they are incredible. So it's when you're talking to the people that are taking the SOM exams, they're not having that luck, and I'll take luck over skill any day. And so a lot of them specialize in orange wines, which have skin contact with a lot of phenolics. I'm not a big fan. Or natural wines, which often have a lot of flaws in them because you're not using sulfur to eliminate them. So, or they'll get into something really esoteric, and I completely understand it. It's too bad that we can't all taste the great wines, but I'm lucky and I'll take it.
Tell me about the biggest changes you've seen in Oregon in the wine industry.
Well, the first one I could see happening, there was a winery that was within 1 day of losing its bond. And a guy came into the tasting room, and we were talking, and he was a real estate agent. And he had a client, and I think they were French, but he couldn't disclose who it was. And I said, well, I know this winery's in trouble. And they were a pretty prominent winery with a big reputation. And he went to them, and they said, well, who are you representing? And he said, well, they've asked me not to tell. And they said, well, then we won't sell to you because they might be Californian. And I thought that was kind of funny. And then when the north end of the county and Goldschmidt went to Drouin, and Robert had been coming here since the early 80s. I had met him several times, and when he would go to Nick's, he would order an Amity 78 Reserve Pinot, which was really like a really good Burgundy of the day. And he was always very, very thoughtful, very polite, and not pushy at all. But they went there to court him, and so what they did is, in a sense, I kind of feel like they misused the lottery funds, because they went there and brought in a foreign corporation that didn't employ very many people, but they did it saying, oh, this is going to help our industry. Well, I went, okay, you've got a big money outfit coming in. We're going to see it. This is the beginning. And it was. And they didn't make a big footprint. They were very respectful of everybody, although I remember Michael Adelsheim going, they're taking all our growers. I thought, well, what do you expect? These guys are professionals. And what happened was, then I started seeing a lot of people coming in from New York City, and they're like, yep, they're trying to buy Dreyfus Ashby, which is this big distributorship, and they're selling Polini Montrachet on street corners in Manhattan for pennies on the dollar. And what they did was they got the funds from the lottery, and they built the winery. And originally the first vintage was done at Chehalem. And then, because of the Dreyfus Ashby thing, they sold 51% to Snow Brands, their Japanese distributor, which was huge, but very, very smart. They knew the Drouins knew the business, and so the deal was, if you disagree with us, we will take your word for it and follow your direction. And every 5 years there was a buyout possibility. So eventually they bought them out when they got all their feet underneath them. So, and they've never been an intrusive factor. Then I knew a guy who was hired to work on the archery summit, and the GM and his wife for Druin lived right down the road, and they cut down some trees to put in the cellar, and his wife was really upset. She thought they were old growth at 50 years old, and she was a very nice lady. So, but they got that all built, and that was big money. And that was, I could just see it coming, because I had actually done Pinot Camp one time, which as a counselor, I got a little turned off. I'm like, I hated summer camp, and I'm not going to make anybody do the camp song or blow the stinking whistle. You know, these guys are adults. So, but I remember them talking, and that was quite a while back in Pinot Camp, and at that time, acre of vineyard land in the Dundee Hills was $13,000, which it's definitely not anymore. So now we've got an Italian, Santa Margherita owns Rocco. There's another Italian, they bought somebody up in the Dundee Hills. Bollinger owns Ponzi. Foley owns Four Graces. And then Kendall Jackson owns Willakenzie and Penarash.
Grand Moraine.
Grand Moraine, yeah. So,
and Constellation is here. They own Lingua Franca.
Yeah, and I'm not real excited about those big boys. And Vintage Estates is here, and they own Firesteed, Tamarack, from Walla Walla and Owen Rowe, and they went bankrupt in California.
Just like a week ago.
Yeah, and so, I mean, they own Clos Pegase, which is ridiculously expensive. It's underground in Napa. You'll never get enough money off of those wines to pay for it, and especially the market has changed. And then we had $2 Chuck, and that guy, I read a article on him in the New Yorker, talk about arrogant. He's like, yeah, I went to school with all these guys, and they're charging these ridiculous amounts of money, and they can't sell it, so they don't want anybody to know, so they won't reduce the price, so I get it for pennies on the dollar, and then he finds ways to dilute it out. And there was a divorce, so he got $2 Chuck, and his wife got Franzia, which is wine in a box and not very good wine. But I will say that his wines are clean. And it's really interesting because it's $3 Chuck in Oregon and $2 Chuck in Cali, where he's based. But so I was talking to, the last thing we were talking about judging. I don't like the Davis 20-point scale. A full quarter of it's all about appearance. It's about commercialism, not quality, as far as I'm concerned. So I said, well, let's try developing our own scale. So we do all this, and then somebody brought a Chardonnay, and we tasted it blind. We didn't know where it's from. And they gave it 6 out of 10 points, and it was a $2 Chuck. And they were so embarrassed, they beat every other wine to a pulp for the rest of the night, you know. So it points out something about judging. You've got to, when I encourage people to give the judges a neutral, like a first flight that has nothing to do with the judging, just wines left over from another time, so that you can calibrate your palate and get into it. And I'm the only judge that went for all the years of SIP. I was there every year, and now there's no more judging, unfortunately. And they were really elevating it. Unfortunately, it's not happening anymore. It was turning into a really premium judging.
Well, thank you so much. Taking the time, coming down, chatting with us today. We'll let you have the hook for at least part one.
Okay.
Thanks, Patrick.